Good afternoon. Welcome to this public lecture on the topic of the Pacific, the World Trade Organization and global trade, the WTO and its relevance to the Pacific countries. The Director General of the World Trade Organization, His Excellency Roberto Azevedo, Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Derek Armstrong, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Before we progress with the program today, may I kindly invite the ladies from the University of the South Pacific to kindly garland our guests this afternoon. Thank you very much. Without further ado, may I now invite the Professor Derek Armstrong, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of the South Pacific, to make welcome remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. And Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Roberto Azevedo, Secretary General, Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Dame Meg Taylor, Permanent Representative of the Fiji Islands Forum Secretariat to the WTO, Ms. Mere Falamaki, senior trade officials of the Pacific regional governments, the Acting Dean, Faculty of Business and Economics, Professor Arvind Patel, invited guests present here and those who are joining us by the live streaming from our regional campuses this evening, staff and students of the university, ladies and gentlemen, Nisambala Vanaka, and a very good and warm evening to you, a warm welcome to you this evening to the University of the South Pacific. The timing of this event is actually very good for the university. At the moment, as you may be aware, the university is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And it is very fitting, therefore, that in this important year, we are able to host this important lecture this evening by the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Roberto Azevedo. Now, in our opening remarks this evening, Dame Meg Taylor, I understand, will cover the Pacific trade agenda and provide a broader picture of regional trade issues facing our small and vulnerable developing economies. Facilitating consistent trade from the region is no doubt difficult, and I salute the regional trade agencies, including the WTO, for leading us through these difficulties. As a technical and academic institution, we will also actively do our best to facilitate and promote such activities for the benefit of our region. The public lecture by Director General Roberto Azevedo will focus on the World Trade Organization and its relevance to the Pacific countries' trade and development. Given the nature of our economies, the World Trade Organization's special and preferential treatment continues to promote our economies and the welfare of the Pacific communities, including others in the ACP region. The WTO has been very accommodating in providing technical and capacity development support to the region, and the presence of the PIF's permanent resident in Geneva is hallmark proof of this. This lecture this evening allows the DG, I think, the opportunity to add to the series of collaborative events that I'll be hosting here at the university. Earlier in February this year, we hosted a two-day Aid for Trade conference jointly organized by the WTO, the Asia Development Bank, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. Furthermore, in collaboration with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, we have been providing technical support to trade-related workshops and training for regional trade specialists over the years. We will also provide our input to the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy consultations, which are forthcoming. And I gather that the School of Economics is organising a half-day seminar on economic partnership agreements jointly with the European Union later this week, on Friday I think it is. I'm also informed that the WTO would like us to host their intensive training on trade policy framework for the region, and I'm looking forward to those conversations later this evening with the Director General. So the university appreciates collaborations with our development partners and crop agencies. We have achieved many milestones together through such engagements, and I acknowledge PIFs and WTO and their continued engagement with the university. I look forward to both the excellent presentations this evening and to the discussions that will follow. Renaka, Bakalevu, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Derek Armstrong. Without further ado, I'd now like to invite the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Dame Meg Taylor, to come and give an introductory statement.
Good evening, and a very warm welcome to Your Excellency, the Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo. I also acknowledge the Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Derek Armstrong, and distinguished guests. And let me join your Deputy Vice Chancellor in welcoming our guest who's travelled many miles to be with us, a native of Brazil, who keeps telling me that this distance to the Pacific is longer than going home to Brazil from Geneva. But I want to say thank you to the university for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on the history of regional trade this evening. Let me take you back to the establishment of the South Pacific Bureau for Economic Cooperation, today known as the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Founded in 1971, SPEC was established to facilitate continuing cooperation, consultation between members on trade, economic development, transport, tourism, and other related matters. From its foundation, the Pacific Island Forum has long recognized the benefit of working together and the advantages of closer cooperation and coordination. Pacific leaders have committed to harnessing our collective strength to work together to address our common challenges. With this in mind, Forum leaders in 2017 reaffirmed the framework for Pacific regionalism as their platform for renewed commitment to collective action. In addition, leaders also recognized the Blue Pacific identity as the core driver for regional and collective action. Since the inception of the Pacific Islands Forum, regional trade has been an area where we have been able to demonstrate an ability to work together as one Pacific. In the 1970s and 1980s, we sought to establish the foundations for inter-regional trade, as well as trade with the world. And so it was during this period that we entered into foundational agreements such as the South Pacific Regional Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement. Some of you may remember Spartica, an agreement amongst Forum members through which Australia and New Zealand provided duty-free entry on imports originating from the Forum Island countries. And the Lomé Convention between the European Union and the ACP states, the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific states, offering duty-free or concessional duties on selected Pacific exports. As we know, the 1990s saw rapid advances in globalization, coupled with progress in ICT, laid the foundation for an increasingly liberalized world economy. The entry into force of the World Trade Organization agreements in 1995 saw the reduction of trade barriers in goods, services and investment, and led to significant increases in global trade. In the Pacific, the trade agenda during this time focused on regional economic integration and increasing our linkages with the global economy. During this period, we sought to engage in multilateral processes with a view to ensuring that our regional interests were taken on board in global negotiations. As we entered the new millennium, Pacific Island countries concluded the Pacific Islands Country Trade Agreement, PICTA, a free trade agreement amongst the 14 Forum Island countries which would assist their gradual integration into global trade, and successfully for several of our member states trading actively under this arrangement, Fiji and Samoa in particular. Trade relations and negotiations between the Pacific and the European Union then dominated a significant portion of the first decade of the 2000s, with the negotiation of the Pacific EU Economic Partnership Agreement. The Pacific ACP states concluded the negotiations of their interim EPA in 2007. These were the most challenging and prolonged trade negotiations undertaken by the Pacific region to date. And negotiations on a comprehensive EPA were suspended in 2016. As a result, the interim EPA agreement remains the only legally binding trade agreement between the Pacific and the European Union that interested Pacific states may accede to. To date, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Samoa have signed on as parties to the interim EPA. Alongside the EPA negotiations, Forum Island countries have also negotiated the PACER Plus arrangements with Australia and New Zealand, which was launched in 2009. While PACER Plus is another example of the region's collective effort to work towards greater economic integration, the agreement also demonstrates the profound political nature of trade. The agreement, as concluded, is now for members' own considerations with regards to ratification. Trade is a globalizing agenda based on the principles of interdependency. On the multilateral front, the WTO has progressed a more liberalized trade environment. In recognition of this process, our leaders agreed to establish a regional representative office in Geneva to enable the Pacific Island countries to have a voice in the WTO to defend their trade interests. And with us, we have our ambassador to the WTO here with us this afternoon, Ambassador Valameka. Since the establishment of the WTO in 1995, 6 Pacific Island countries have become full members, namely Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. As a region, we know we can achieve more if we work together, a principle which leaders have reaffirmed in endorsing the framework for Pacific regionalism. And throughout history, the Pacific Islands Forum has long understood the importance of having arrangements in place that would ensure that as a region we can engage in trade, whether within our own region or with the world, in ways that benefit our membership and our people. And why shouldn't we? After all, we lay claim to much for which the world desires, above, within and below our great Pacific Ocean. And so the onus is on us to support the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum to leverage these resources as the basis for negotiations regarding global trade and economic integration. On that note, let me again offer you a warm welcome to the Pacific, and we look forward to hearing the perspectives of the WTO. Vinaka.
Thank you very much, Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. As has been intimated by Dame Meg Taylor and also the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of the South Pacific, we are indeed quite privileged to have here with us our guest speaker, His Excellency Mr. Roberto Azevedo. I'd now like to request him to come and present a public lecture for this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Dame Meg Taylor, Professor Armstrong, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everyone, and hello to those who are watching online, so thanks for tuning in. I don't know where they are, but wherever. I'm very pleased to be here today at the University of the South Pacific, and thank you very much for your kind invitation, and by the way, congratulations then on the 50 years as the leading academic institution in the Pacific. And I think that this institution embodies the close cooperation, unique challenges and opportunities that exist here in the Pacific. It is jointly owned by 12 governments and has a diverse student base from all across the region. So this is actually my first visit to Fiji and to the Pacific Islands as WTO Director General. In fact, as in any capacity, this is my visit to Fiji, so it is a real pleasure to join you. I think that there is a very special link between this region and the World Trade Organization, and I think it is because of the strong bonds that exist between the countries of the region and the important role of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. And I have often found myself that it is precisely the smaller nations that are more outward facing than others and more engaged with the world outside their borders. Countries that are not great powers, they rely more on the global system of cooperation and rules to ensure precisely that they have a fair go. And of course, smaller economies desperately need access to other markets in order to grow and develop. Now, the WTO provides all this. It provides a platform for you to engage in the global economy under multilaterally agreed rules, and it provides also an opportunity for you to pursue your interests. And that is what you do. Precisely. Working together, the Pacific Islands have become important players in the debate at the WTO over the years. You have used the global system to address your needs, and I will detail some of the areas where real progress has been made in a moment. I'll get there, but of course there is much more to do, so I urge all of you to remain active and engaged. With a very strong and united stance and sharing many common interests, you do really have a voice in Geneva. And your representatives there do a very excellent job in making this voice heard. In fact, when I talked about smaller economies just a moment ago, perhaps I should have chosen my words more carefully, because according to some estimates, the members of the Pacific Island Forum cover over 40 million square kilometers of land and sea. So that is bigger than the European Union and ASEAN combined. Now, this offers, of course, great potential in terms of access to natural resources. And at the same time, of course, it also poses challenges of distance, of vulnerability, and to natural disasters for once. So again, I think that your desire to meet these opportunities and challenges stands behind your record as champions of international cooperation and multilateralism. Now, we all know that the hard work of the Pacific Island nations was essential in securing the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And Fiji, of course, played a very key role in presiding over COP23 in Bonn just last year. The Pacific Island countries are also a driving force behind the Oceans Conference in New York that happened just last year. And it focused on the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14 on the conservation and sustainable use of the oceans and marine resources for sustainable development. Now, the simple fact is that we are better placed to deal with the challenges before us, and these are global challenges, when we work together. Now, with your leadership, advocacy, those things are particularly important today. These are challenging times for multilateralism. I don't think I have to tell you that. All you have to do is take a look at the newspapers. And this applies on a number of fronts. And I will focus now particularly on what we're seeing in the trading system. So when I say challenges for multilateralism, I'm not only talking about trade, I'm talking about multilateralism in general. Now, we have all seen recent headlines about rising tensions among major trading partners. Now, despite these tensions, trade is actually performing very well, and it continues to help to drive the global economic recovery. Now, trade grew at a rate of 4.7% last year. That was the strongest performance since 2011. And in 2011, it was rebounding from the dip after 2008. And we do expect that this growth is going to continue for the next 2 years, for this year, maybe next year. And we see now the economic cycles between China, the United States, and the European Union synchronizing in a way that we have not seen for a decade. So this is good news. All of this is good news. It means that trade is playing its part in supporting growth, development, and job creation. However, and there is always a however, all of this could be put in jeopardy if the tensions that we have been seeing continue to escalate. Now, the global economy is profoundly interconnected today, and this multiplies the complication that trade restrictive actions can cause. So two-thirds of world trade occurs through global value chains. That means that at least one component of a product has crossed the border when it is being traded. Now, in this context of interconnectivity, the effects of any shocks to the trading system would likely be globalized, and it will be reaching far beyond those countries that are directly involved in those tensions. The Pacific region is unlikely to be immune to all of this, so we have to do everything we can to stop this from further escalation. And I have been working closely with WTO members and urging them to take every action possible to avoid going down this road. Instead of escalating tensions, what we do need to have is we need to find ways to resolve these tensions in a constructive manner. And the WTO has a key role to play here. The organization was in fact created as a forum for members to find ways to cooperate and resolve issues and hold each other to account. And this is what we have been doing for quite some time now. And in fact, I would argue that without the WTO, we would have started a trade war some years ago. Now, after the crisis of 2008, and this is very striking, we did not see the kind of outbreak of protectionist policies as we did in the past, and as people were expecting at that point in time. Because, and if that had happened, that could have dramatically worsened the economic fallout. However, the reality is that the share of world imports that are covered by import restrictive measures that were adopted since 2008 until today, so from 2008 until today, that percentage is just 5%. Only 5% of global trade has been affected by trade restrictive measures since 2008. Now, this quite contained reaction to the post-2008 protectionist pressures, and they did exist, is precisely because of the framework of rules and practices provided by the multilateral trading system, provided by the WTO. So we need clearly to safeguard the system so that it can keep playing this role and so that it can keep supporting growth and development around the world. But just preserving the system is not enough. And I think that's the point. We have also to ensure that it helps to provide more opportunities, especially for those who need these opportunities the most. Now, ensuring that everyone has the skills and tools that they need to participate is an essential part of creating a trading system that is truly global and that is truly inclusive. And for this very reason, we put a very special focus to the trade conditions of the small island developing economies through our work program on small economies in the WTO. And this has delivered some pretty important decisions in the favor of countries like the Pacific Islands. And we have a number of initiatives to help countries build trading capacities. We do that through the WTO's Aid for Trade initiative. We provide developing countries with targeted assistance to improve their trading infrastructure. Since 2006, the initiative has committed around $4.1 billion to Pacific Island economies. We also support an initiative called the Enhanced Integrated Framework, and this one helps least developed countries to build their capacity to trade. The EIF, that's the Enhanced Integrated Framework, it has developed a number of projects in the Pacific helping countries leverage their trading potential. For example, Vanuatu has been helped in rebuilding its tourism infrastructure in the aftermath of Cyclone Pam. And on all of these fronts, we work very closely with the Geneva missions of the Pacific Island Forum's Secretariat to ensure precisely that these initiatives are focused and that they deliver to the actual needs of the country. So, I should note also that a number of Pacific members, namely Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, they have also opened missions in Geneva, and I'm hopeful that the others will follow in due course. Greater engagement in Geneva gives the chance to learn more about the WTO and to help to shape the trading system in your favor. Now, members are making progress in this direction by delivering new reforms to the system. You hear sometimes people say that the WTO has been paralyzed or hasn't been functioning. That's misinformation. We have done quite a bit. In recent years, we have delivered a number of very meaningful agreements. In 2013, in Bali, we delivered the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Now, it was the biggest multilateral deal in a generation, and it will have huge economic significance, potentially cutting trade costs globally by an average of 14.3%, with the biggest gains going for developing and least developed countries, including here in the Pacific. And these measures are particularly significant when your trade costs are already high due to the great distances that your importers and exporters have to deal with. Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, they all have already ratified this deal, and I am encouraging the other WTO members of the Pacific Islands to do the same as quickly as possible. So I was talking about 2013. In 2015, so 2 years later, in Nairobi, Kenya, members came together to deliver the biggest farm reform since the creation of the WTO, with the decision to abolish and completely eliminate agricultural export subsidies. Now, members have also agreed on a number of steps on cotton and measures to help the poorest countries to boost their trading potential. So all of this shows that the WTO's 164 members, they can work together in a meaningful way in trying to solve the most complex problems that they face and deliver, of course, on the priorities of the most vulnerable. The latest stage of this journey was our ministerial conference in Buenos Aires last year, and that was in December last. So at that conference, we did not conclude final agreements there, but members laid down some very positive foundations that we are now trying to build on. Levels of political support were very high in Buenos Aires, and members committed to continuing negotiations in all areas, and that's written in the summary of the chair, including the Doha issues. And this is very important. And ministers also took an important decision on fisheries subsidies, which I know is a key area of interest for this region. While we didn't get the ambitious outcomes that many were hoping for in Buenos Aires, including myself, of course, it was a very significant step forward. Members committed to adopt an agreement on disciplines that prohibit certain forms of fishery subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and to eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Now, this is a key target of the Sustainable Development Goal 14 on the conservation and sustainable use of our oceans. Now, clearly, the oceans are a tremendous resource, but they must be used responsibly and sustainably so that the blue economy can continue to serve future generations. But I don't think I need to tell you that. According to the World Bank, a more sustainable fisheries economy could boost public revenues in the Pacific Islands by $300 million per year by 2040, and it could create 15,000 additional jobs. So this is a huge opportunity, and I think that our work at the WTO can make an important contribution to achieve these goals. Members have agreed in Geneva, they have agreed already on a work program for fisheries subsidies negotiations for the coming months. Meetings already started last week in Geneva, so let's make sure that we deliver on this very vital issue. Also, in Buenos Aires, groups of WTO members announced new initiatives in a number of areas that they find important. So they are now talking about how to help promote electronic commerce for inclusiveness, how to support smaller businesses to trade so that they are not crowded out by the bigger players, how to facilitate investments, and also how to ensure that trade contributes fully to the economic empowerment of women. So there have been meetings under each of these initiatives that I just mentioned in the recent months, and in each case there seems to be real momentum. It is very positive that members are seeking to use the WTO to tackle matters that they consider to be of pressing economic importance. And it is interesting to look at the composition of these new groups, because they encompass developed countries, developing countries, least developed countries from all regions. So, of course, each member of the WTO will have to determine for themselves whether and how to engage in these areas. Now, that said, I think that there could be interesting opportunities for the Pacific Islands here. Studies show, and this is just an illustration, that improved internet connectivity in the Pacific Islands could add more than $5 billion to the region's GDP and close to 300,000 additional jobs by 2040. So more investment, particularly in infrastructure, could also help the region to tackle many of its trade costs and boost the Pacific's integration into the global economy. We know that building a resilient infrastructure is a priority in the Pacific, especially due to the ever-present risk of natural disasters. The economic costs of such events are very high, to say nothing about the human cost itself. Some estimates show that these disasters can hit GDP by 0.5 to 6.6% annually. That's huge. And climate change will only increase the level of risk and vulnerability. Rigorous studies suggest that the frequency and the severity of natural disasters are likely to increase. So this issue is not going away. So we need to be better prepared and better informed the next time we are called upon to respond. And in this vein, the WTO members have started already a dialogue very recently in Geneva on how trade policies and practices can help in dealing with natural disasters. The wrong measure could stifle recovery, erode resilience, and restrain development. But the right policy can help improve supply-side capacity and restore trade after a disaster, boosting recovery. So we have to get this right, and we have to contribute in any way we can. To help inform this discussion, just last month, we launched a new research project to help countries analyze how trade can help them respond to and recover from natural disasters and build resilience to such events. It is a very important piece of work. I am confident that the trade community can play a positive role in responding to this very urgent issue, and I'm ready to support the WTO members in this effort. So the WTO is here to serve members. It is here to serve you. And I want to see the WTO helping this region to meet the big challenges ahead, whether it's meeting the urgent imperative of development or delivering improved resilience and recovery from natural disasters. And I want to do all we can to help you seize some of the big opportunities on the horizons too. So whether it's boosting tourism, creating a framework for more sustainable fisheries, or realizing the benefits of improved internet access and connectivity, that's our job. But to deliver, we also need your support, especially at a time when multilateralism is under strain. So I do urge all countries in the region to use the system and speak up for the system and for your interests in the system. Global cooperation is a precious resource. So it is the only way that we will meet the challenges before us and seize the opportunities. It is the only way to deliver the kind of future that I believe that people in this region want and deserve. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all to that end, and who knows, hope to see you in Geneva at some point in time. So thank you all very much. Again, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, His Excellency, Mr. Roberto Azevedo, Director General of the World Trade Organization. He has, of course, highlighted some very, very important points that we could perhaps ponder on during the questions and answer session this afternoon. Highlighted in particular is the importance of global cooperation in meeting the challenges and also in delivering development that is much needed here in the Pacific region. The WTO is here to serve its members and the region to address resilience and also ways of recovering from natural disasters, and more importantly, on capitalizing on the opportunities that could emanate from being integrated into the multilateral trading system, whether it be in the area of tourism development of the fisheries sector in the region, and also improving connectivity through investment in infrastructure development. We now have a question and answer session. Before I invite questions from the floor, may I kindly request that you do indicate or introduce yourself before you raise your questions. And may I also emphasize this afternoon that the questions are to be diverted, of course, to His Excellency Mr. Roberto Azevedo, and in particular to the speech that he has just delivered this afternoon. The floor is now open for any questions that you may have. We'll take a round of questions and then invite His Excellency to respond. Do we have a roving mic that could be utilized by... Thank you very much.
Published on the Pacific in the global trade negotiations. I have recently published a history of the Pacific participation in global trade negotiations at the WTO and regional trade negotiations. But my question relates specifically to your presentation. You mentioned, of course, the very important issue of climate change, an issue that's close to our heart here in the Pacific. Fiji, first nation in the world to ratify the Paris Agreement, was hit a week later by the strongest cyclone ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere. So, of course, this is an issue that affects development in the Pacific. But my question is with regards to climate change mitigation. So, and what role for the global trade regime around the world? Every year, there's something like $450 billion worth of subsidies for fossil fuel production. So WTO members worldwide are subsidizing the production of fossil fuels, which of course is driving climate change and seems ridiculous. So the question is, I have two questions. One is a general question. How can the WTO help with tackling subsidies for fossil fuels? And the more specific question, closer to home, in this part of the world, the largest contributor to climate change is coal exports from Australia. Australia is the world's largest coal exporter, currently subsidises fossil fuel production and export to the tune of $11 billion a year, and is proposing things like a $1 billion concessional loan for what will be the world's largest export coal mine. And the specific question is concessional loans for coal exports WTO legal?
Thank you, DG, for the very excellent presentation. At the very outset, I just wanted to commend your leadership, because normally countries, or as you have mentioned, that some say that the WTO is paralyzed, but from my view, I believe that the World Trade Organization and the voice of individual members have never been this strong under any leadership, from my personal observation. So for that I commend you. And forgive me, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Radhika Kumar. I'm from the School of Economics, and I'm a lecturer in international economics. I have two questions in relation to your presentation. The first one, you've mentioned that in the WTO, yes, there's discussions on the pending Doha issues, and there's discussions on the new issues. So in relation to the new initiatives, you've mentioned about e-commerce, and you've also mentioned about the importance of internet connectivity. From my previous interactions at the WTO, I note that some members are not contesting the notion of the importance of e-commerce, right, to development. But in terms of the disciplines in relation to e-commerce, there has been some issues. And for instance, in terms of the ITU database on the ICT Development Index, looking at that, there's still a huge digital divide amongst the developed and the developing countries. And then the ICT Development Index, it has access to internet, it has got readiness of a country, and also infrastructure. So those are three components that form the ICT Development Index. So my question is, should countries, from what you may provide a personal perception, should countries go on to having the disciplines on e-commerce right now, or should small island states, given the digital divide, organize their domestic sector policies first before even engaging into the disciplines on e-commerce regulations? And also on the latest, which I also read on the initiative on the discussions on trade and natural disaster. Of course, we also understand that WTO is a multilateral trading system and it makes trade rules. So looking at the existing Doha issues and in relation to trade and natural disasters, food security and public stockholding was something which even the small island states were demanding in terms of future food security, in terms of agriculture, food security and public stockholding. So my question is, can the issue of trade and natural disaster be tackled within the current Doha issues, perhaps looking at some of these discussions where issues of trade and natural disaster can be captured? Just your personal view, as I also know, DG, you were also a former negotiator.
Thank you very much, Radhika. We have another question up here in the front.
My name is James. I'm a second year computing student. So my apologies in advance for my ignorance on this matter. So you said the WTO, it's a trade broker, you could say, between two nations. So my concern is that the WTO could be, how one might say, bribed, or how do you say, when trade agreements are made, it could benefit certain groups or corporations. So my question is, the WTO is an organization, an international organization, who polices the WTO? And also on that, the other gentleman referred to climate change, right? So in regards to climate change, you're going to penalize, I think, that's what you might do, to put tariffs on coal imports and exports, and that could be seen as a political move or taking a side on the matter. So those are my two questions. Who polices you? And would nations get to decide on climate change? Or who polices the WTO? Like who investigates your, I guess, because you can broker agreements if that's...
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Director General, for the presentation. Mine goes to a slide. My name is Mark Lipton. I am the Research Director for the Pacific Regional ICT Regulatory Resource Center, which is based here at the University of the South Pacific, and we are funded by World Bank. My question goes to the WTO decision-making dispute resolution process. Recently, after a 14-year debate, the decision was rendered on aircraft, the chief components being Boeing and Airbus. Small countries such as Fiji and the others in the Pacific wind up being at the back end of those disputes because as the replacement part costs rise, the costs rise to the flag carriers of these countries, Fiji Airways, the new Samoa Air, etc. So while the core product winds up being cheaper, and that is the subject of the dispute, the replacement parts, so the ongoing maintenance of those finished products that are subject to the dispute, wind up going up. And the 14 years winds up costing these flag carriers or the other purchasers of products that are subject to the dispute at the WTO. My question is whether there is a movement at the WTO to speed the dispute resolution process so that these impacts are not so heavily felt by these small economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I now invite His Excellency Mr. Roberto Azevedo to respond to those 4 questions.
So many questions. I could take another hour or so answering each one of them, but I will try to be concise and as clear as I can about each one of them. On climate change, and particularly the issue of how the WTO can help and what can be done in the WTO. I think we have to be quite clear. The WTO is not the forum for the discussion on climate change. We have that in the UN, and that's what they do. So there is no forum of conversations in the WTO to address specifically the issue of climate change. What we try to do is how can trade in one way or another help the issue of climate change. So for example, but that at the end of the day is of the initiative of members. It's not the WTO, I myself or the Secretariat that is going to drive the agenda. We cannot do that. The moment I try to do that, members will crucify me, and I'm not keen to be crucified right now. So they have to take the initiative, and they have been taking the initiative in some ways. For example, there were ongoing negotiations on environmental goods and services. So that was a way to facilitate the dissemination of technologies that reduce the emission of carbon and that facilitate or help the green economy. Now, that negotiation got stuck recently for reasons that I don't have to be very detailed. But that is one possibility. That is something that we were doing. Another one is fisheries subsidies, where fossil fuel subsidies is part of that conversation as well, but directed to areas where that could lead to overfishing or to IUU, so illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So we try to find, or members try to find in the WTO, ways where the trade component of the global economy can help with the cause of climate change. Now, that's something that members have to figure out, but we're not going to have in the WTO a conversation about the emission. What we do have sometimes is members who want to impose, you may be familiar with that, border tax adjustments, for example. For countries who have a very dirty matrix of energy, they want to impose some kind of tax to offset the emission of carbon in those countries, for example, or pollution. That never went very far because, as you can imagine, the economic interests are very big and very sensitive, and the matrices are very different. So what happens with the one that has a cleaner energy? Do you give him a bonus? And that conversation never really took off, although this is something that every once in a while comes up. But we have to see how that goes. But again, the WTO is not a climate change forum. This is not what we do there. There is another agency that does that. Now, and that, I think, indirectly responds to the question about emissions of coal energy, coal-driven energy. We don't do that. This is not what we do over there. However, there is growing pressure from consumers in particular who are overseeing the degree of emission that some products and some countries have. Now, that is something that there is a possibility that something like that will create a consciousness on the part of countries to begin to change their matrix. And that's already changing. There are some countries who have clearly been trying to clean up their matrices. Not everyone. Some big economies are not quite engaged in that effort, but others are. I think this is a process. We don't have the mechanism to do that, but that doesn't stop any country to introducing trade measures that try to achieve that goal. A lot of people think because we are an organization that forces free trade, that you can't do anything that restricts trade to achieve a health concern or an environmental concern or whatever. That's simply not true. That's not true. You can, and many countries have done that, and there is space for that. But this is again an initiative on the part of the members. On the Doha issues, the new issues, e-commerce, well, there was a lot there. I understood the question on e-commerce to be about do we negotiate disciplines now? Do we wait later because developing countries are still lagging and things like that? Look, each country will decide what they want to do. Now, my personal perspective is that you will never be ready for the digital economy. The digital economy is already way ahead from any kind of regulation or any kind of oversight that countries have at this point in time, especially in developing countries, even in developed countries. So you'll never reach a situation where you're going to have perfect symmetry between the developed and the developing countries or e-commerce and the other more physical economy. Now, having said that, the situation is this. This is the future, right? Because we're just taking the first baby steps in e-commerce. People think about a digital economy and they think that we have changed. So we're just beginning. This is the beginning. This is the infancy of the digital economy. Now, this is going to change fast and this is going to change big. So the reality is that countries are beginning to come to terms with what that means. For example, consumer protection. What kind of consumer protection do you have when you buy a product that's coming from another country? There is no importer any longer. You deal directly with the exporter. So whose law applies? Electronic signatures, or even more privacy issues. Do countries protect in the same way or differently? All those issues are out there. And they're very difficult to handle. Now, so they're trying to negotiate and talk about standards. Do we need standards? And if so, which standards will foster the economy, not stifle the economy? So that's another discussion. Now, that conversation is going to happen. You cannot expect that if the WTO does not have this conversation, that the world will stop. It is going to happen. If it not happens in the WTO, it will happen at the OECD, it will happen in the G20, it will happen somewhere. So the WTO, a conversation in the WTO at least offers the developing countries and the smaller economies a chance to participate in this conversation, to try to give their perspective in that conversation. I, for example, have been saying to the proponents who have been discussing this in the WTO, they have to give a focus also on infrastructure, on connectivity. Some countries in the WTO, they say, how can we talk about e-commerce? I barely have energy, right? Electricity. So how do we do that? And that's something that we have to be mindful of. The only way that you can get a conversation that is inclusive, that takes everybody's perspective, is to have participants of all levels of development and all levels of the size of the economy. Otherwise the big are going to do it. And it's going to be their rules. It's going to be their standards with nobody else's input. And I think that would be regrettable. That's my view. Now, disciplines now or later, look, you decide. You want disciplines, you participate. If you don't want disciplines, you're out. You don't participate. I think that the future of the WTO and the future of multilateralism is in flexibility. If you try to impose things on everyone, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So we need to be flexible. We need to allow countries to participate, to engage, and to accept disciplines to the extent that they want to the extent that they can. And that's something that we should bear in mind. On the Doha issues and the new issues, I think the Doha issues are still very much part of the conversation. I think members who are driving conversations on investments, facilitation, on small and medium enterprises, on e-commerce, they want the Doha issues. They're big proponents of several pillars of the Doha issues conversation. They're not going to let that go. However, having said that, they also think that there are other things that you cannot leave behind. It's not because I didn't clean the kitchen that I'm not going to clean my bedroom. I have to do both at the same time. So that's something that members are grappling with, is how to continue to push the conversation on the Doha issues and at the same time deal with some other things that they need to address. And that's the dilemma there, that some would like to put a sequence in this conversation. And others don't feel that that's the way to go. Now, about the WTO, who has oversight over the WTO? I have 164 landlords. All of them oversee us. They are the owners of the system. Those are the members. They are sovereign. We say in the WTO, this is a member-driven organization. It actually is a member-driven organization. They are the ones who decide on the agenda. They are the ones who decide what to do. The secretariat sometimes, it can only put a paper or a study or a suggestion or speak if members let them. Otherwise, they won't. So the supervision is the members' supervision. There's nobody else doing that. And it's a very strict and constant supervision, by the way. On climate change and tariffs, I think I mentioned that in the context of the tax border adjustments that some talk about. That's an extremely complex conversation. If I begin to get into that, those of you who are not asleep yet would definitely fall asleep very quickly. So this is something that I would suggest, if you are interested really in this issue, to talk to us, and we'll get somebody in the Secretariat who has some expertise on this to give you at least material to take a look at. But this is a conversation that has been happening for a long time, and like I said before, no progress has been made there. Even in the US, I think there was a bill to introduce tariffs like that, but they abandoned that effort a while back. On the dispute settlement mechanism, I think the issue of participation is very important. Developing countries, and in particular the small economies, it's not a level playing field. I don't think it is. If it were, even if it were evolving in the way that it was originally conceived, which the cost would then be much lower than it is today to participate in the system, even then it would still be uneven. Even the outcome is about if you win and the other side does not comply, you have the right to retaliate. Now, what kind of retaliation is a small economy going to have when they're fighting against a big economy? So the system is not perfect. It was not made for the small economies, I have to say that. It was made to solve the disputes of the big economies. It was Japan, the EU, the US that were having trade disputes and escalation in the 80s, if you remember that. And then they needed to do something. And that was essentially the reason why the WTO and the dispute settlement of the WTO was born. Now, so it is not perfect. I entirely agree. What members are trying to do, particularly donors, they are subsidizing the participation of small economies by, for example, supporting the advisory center for WTO law. So those are lawyers that are subsidized by donors. So if a small economy wants to bring a dispute against another country in the WTO, they have the support of those lawyers at subsidized rates. They still pay something, but it's much lower. So that's something that is being done, and that helps, and they use it. They use it, and they're very successful. They win several cases using that group. Now, in terms of retaliation and things like that, it's never going to be even, not in this way. As far as the speed is concerned, that's a challenge. What I can tell you is that despite the complaints that sometimes it takes a year and a half, maybe two, that is the fastest adjudicating system in the world. So it's still pretty significant how it's done, and the quality is very high. There are complaints, there are, of course, ways to improve it, but it has become very complex. I just want, when I litigated for my country, for Brazil, for several years, And when I started that, I read one, we're beginning to litigate against the EU on sugar. And I read the paper, a similar dispute that happened between the two, Brazil and the EU, under the GATT. And that dispute, it had 25 pages, the whole thing, the description, everything, 25 pages. The report, and that included annexes and everything. There were no annexes at the end of the day. The dispute today, a mid-sized dispute, the report would be about 400 or 500 pages. With the annexes, it's thousands of pages. So it has become much more complex than it was before. And that is a big challenge, I think, for the system. You cannot ask three guys, and I have been one of them in a few instances, to read thousands and thousands of pages and get it done within 30, 50, 60 days. It's not going to happen. So we need to have also the cooperation of members in streamlining and expediting the system.
Your Excellency, my sincere appreciation for the responses, succinct responses that have been duly provided to the questions that were fielded from the floor. I do note that we are now have passed, well past the time for our refreshments, but perhaps before that conclusion of this public lecture. I would like to thank him in particular for responding to the questions that were raised with respect to how trade can help the issue of climate change, a pertinent challenge that the region is currently facing. I do want to thank him as well for explaining about the rules that are ingrained in the WTO system, which enables countries like those WTO members here in the Pacific to implement measures for environmental or health concerns. I would also like to thank you for responding in particular to the questions that were raised about the new issues and clearly identifying the need for the development of global standards on e-commerce to help foster the economies, including those here in the Pacific, and not to stifle it. Infrastructure connectivity is an important issue that he has, of course, raised here at this public lecture as well, and I'd like to thank him as well for emphasizing on that important issue. Before concluding this afternoon, I would also like to thank him in particular for the emphasis that he has made about the need for strong and united stance for a united voice for the Pacific Island countries in Geneva. And we would also like to thank the Ambassador Falemaka, who is here with us, the permanent representative for the Pacific region in the WTO in Geneva, for all the hard work that she has fostered for the region along with her diligent team. So without further ado, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Your Excellency Roberto Azevedo, Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Derek Armstrong, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the public lecture this afternoon. If you do have any additional questions that you would wish to raise with the WTO team, including His Excellency, you're more than welcome to do so during the refreshment which is currently provided here in the foyer. Have a wonderful afternoon.